Hi, I'm Lewis. I'm a philosophy student here at the University of Oxford. I'm currently studying towards a DPhil in philosophy, and if you haven't come across a DPhil before, it's basically a PhD, but Oxford being Oxford likes to say and do things a little bit differently. My main area of interest in philosophy is ethics, so the study of right and wrong. I like to think about the ways in which we as human beings can live our best lives. I feel like there's a little bit of a preconception of philosophers that they like to live up in their ivory towers, philosophizing, and that they aren't always completely in touch with the real world. Well, that might be right in some instances, but that's not always the case. Sometimes philosophy can teach us lessons which are not only interesting, not only surprising, but also really relevant. And it's this kind of philosophy that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about an argument given by a philosopher called Peter Singer, and it's an argument that, if it's right, could really have a big impact on the way that we live our lives. So, as you can see on this title slide, I'm going to be talking about the ethics of global poverty. And I want to begin by hammering home just a few facts about the state of global poverty today. So, according to the World Bank, over 700 million people, that's more than 10 times the entire population of the United Kingdom, are estimated to live on less than $1.90 per day. Now, obviously, that's not nearly enough to cover a human being's basic needs, and recent research from the World Health Organization shows that on average, a child dies every 5 seconds from mostly preventable causes. And even of those who do survive, many of them are unable to access really important things like schools, proper healthcare, and safe drinking water. Now, when people talk about poverty, you'll often hear them use the word avoidable. They'll talk about avoidable deaths and avoidable suffering, because a lot of the time it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, the kind of deaths and even suffering that arise from global poverty could have often been avoided had they had more resources. So, for example, deaths from malnutrition wouldn't have been the case if they'd had enough food. There are lots of deaths from malaria in the developing world, and these might not have been the case if they'd had access to bed nets to prevent the mosquitoes from biting them. And equally, there are many, many cases of blindness, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, caused by a disease called trachoma. This disease is actually really, really cheap and easy to treat through a simple surgery. If they'd had access to this surgery, the blindness wouldn't have come on. But in spite of all of this, in spite of all of these avoidable deaths and avoidable suffering, we in the developed world continue to spend money on luxuries that we don't need. So take this for example. In 2009, the USA spent $8.9 billion on international aid, which might sound good on the surface, but when you consider the fact that they spent $380 billion on tobacco products, which is over 40 times the amount that they spent on international aid, well, it doesn't sound quite so impressive anymore. It's easy to forget or to stick your head in the sand and ignore, but I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that we're living in the middle of a global catastrophe with immense suffering and millions of deaths every year that could have been avoided. But this doesn't have to be the end of the story. If the arguments I'm going to be making in this video are right, then we shouldn't adopt an attitude of defeat or of resignation. Instead, we should see the immense opportunities that we have to make a real world difference and to help those in need. So bringing this back to philosophy, there's a few objectives that I want us to have in mind watching this video. So firstly, I want to demonstrate the opportunities that we have through making donations to effective charities to combat the effect of global poverty. And secondly, I want us to learn how to reflect upon and critically examine social norms. And then finally, we're going to put our ethics hat on for a bit and think about how we can evaluate a range of different actions in moral terms, how to determine which actions seem right and which actions seem wrong. So to begin, let's take a look at one of my favourite thought experiments in philosophy, put forward by Peter Singer in his paper Famine, Affluence and Morality. Just a quick aside first for anyone watching who's thinking about maybe going on to study philosophy. Nowadays, I think it's fair to say that most new philosophical arguments are made in papers or essays in academic journals. You get books too, but there are definitely more papers published than books. All of this is to say that if you want to know a little bit more about what studying philosophy at university is like, it could be worth reading one or two papers first, and this one is definitely a good place to start. I'll mention it again at the end of the video. If you're interested, it's definitely a really thought-provoking, but also really well-written and accessible paper. So in this paper, Peter Singer presents his drowning child thought experiment. So Singer asks us to imagine that you're walking past a pond on your way to delivering a lecture, as you do. And as you're walking past the pond, you take a closer look and you see that there's a child drowning. Now, in this example, you know that if you dive in to save the child, you'll be able to rescue him. But you also know that the child will certainly die without your help. But it's not that simple. Before you dive in, you remember that you're wearing your brand new Hugo Boss suit that you're hoping to wear to your lecture. Let's say it's a suit that costs £3,000, and it'll certainly be ruined beyond repair if you were to jump in. Now, under any plausible system of ethics, you should jump in here. In fact, you'd probably want to say that it would be very wrong for you not to jump in. Nobody wants to ruin their suit, but when the other side of the trade-off is literally a life, it seems to be very wrong indeed for you to prioritize your own suit. Now, up to this point, what you should do seems pretty clear, but this is where the thought experiment becomes provocative. So Singer points out that, in fact, we are actually in this position, in the position of the lecturer by the pond, every single day. The reason is, and this is why the cost of the suit becomes important, £3,000 is also round about the amount of money that the best research shows would be, on average, enough to save a life through the most cost-effective charities. So to be specific, there's an independent charity evaluator, GiveWell. They publish research on their website. You can go on there and read their calculations to see how they arrived at these figures. They show that the Against Malaria Foundation, who they think are one of the most cost-effective charities, they're able to save a life by giving out bed nets in Africa to prevent mosquitoes from biting them and passing on malaria, for an average cost of £3,000 per life saved. So just as the lecturer in the example had what you might call a moral obligation to dive in and save the child, even if it comes at the expense of his £3,000 suit, Singer wants to argue that we too have moral obligations to do what we can to save the lives of people in global poverty, even if it comes at the expense of giving our money away to effective charities. So just to drive home this implication a little bit, if Singer's right, every time that we spend £3,000 on whatever, whether it's buying a nice car, going on a fancy holiday, or whatever non-essential item that we spend our money on, that's £3,000 that we could have spent on saving a life. So, Singer argues, if we agree that it's very wrong for the lecturer to ignore the child, even when doing so involves sacrificing a £3,000 suit, it's equally wrong, it's wrong to the same degree, for us to ignore the incredible opportunities that we have to save lives through a simple donation. Now, of course, this is a provocative argument. It puts many of us on the same moral level as the man who walks by and lets the child drown. And it certainly seems counterintuitive to accept that we have some kind of a moral obligation to give our hard-earned money to charity. Yeah, I mean, you might want to say it's my money, right? It's my choice what I do with it. Well, the point that Singer's trying to put across here would therefore involve radically reimagining our whole conception of charity. If Singer's right, charity isn't just something that we do as and when we fancy it, as and when we fancy doing a good deed. Instead, charity becomes something that we really have to do if we want to meet the minimum standards of being a decent person. And just like walking past and ignoring a dying person on the sidewalk, it's something that's very wrong for us to avoid doing. But to do Singer's argument proper justice, I think it might be useful, particularly to those of you who are hearing Singer's argument for the first time, and most likely having some questions and concerns, to go over just a couple of common objections to Singer's argument and to look at the responses that he gives. So I'll ask you to pause the video at this moment. I want you to take a few minutes to think about whether you think his argument works. Is there anything that Singer's missing here? Are there any differences between the drowning child and the people living in absolute poverty on the other side of the world that explain why we might have a moral obligation to save the child while not having the same kind of moral obligation to give our money to charity. So take a few minutes to think about this. Feel free to discuss it with a friend if you're watching the video together, and when you're ready, press play again and we'll continue. I think one of the most common problems that people find with Singer's argument is that what looks like an analogy between saving the drowning child and giving our money to charity isn't actually an analogy at all. So an intuition that a lot of people have is, well, of course, we simply have to save the drowning child because he's right there, he's right in front of us. But we don't have the same kind of obligation to save statistical, non-identifiable people on the other side of the world because, well, they're not right in front of us. Their suffering is nothing to do with us. The drowning child, well, he's drowning right there. So you might want to say his close proximity to us is what generates the moral obligation to save him, and the lack of any kind of proximity to those dying in the developing world is what explains the fact that we don't have a moral obligation to save them. Well, for me, and certainly for Peter Singer, what's going on here is a muddling of two very different facts, psychological facts and moral facts. So for sure, even Peter Singer would be happy to admit that technically there is a psychological difference between saving the drowning child and giving money to the Against Malaria Foundation, insofar as we've said, the child drowning before us, drowning before our very eyes, conjures up this emotional pull towards him. We're up close and we can empathise with the child drowning in a way that we maybe can't do quite so much with the malaria victims on the other side of the world. We have stronger emotional reasons to save the child than to give money to effective charities. But this psychological fact isn't the same as a moral fact. This doesn't generate stronger moral reasons to save the child. Whether someone is 1 meter in front of you or whether they're on the other side of the world, their suffering and the value of their life is the same and shouldn't make a difference to our moral reasons to save them. Under most systems of ethics, acting in a morally good way requires being impartial. It requires helping people regardless of their race, their nationality, their gender. Morality doesn't tend to allow for assigning a higher value to some lives than to other lives. So, really, if we have an obligation to save the drowning child, the fact that we don't feel the same kind of emotional pull to donate the £3,000 to the Against Malaria Foundation doesn't mean that we don't have an equal moral obligation to give to them. So that's how Singer responds to the first objection. But at this point, I think there'll probably be some people who are happy to say, okay, well, sure, if I really knew that my £3,000 donation would save a life, and that without giving that donation somebody would certainly die, then sure, okay, I have a moral obligation to give my money to charity. But this isn't how the world really works, they might say. In real life, charities just aren't that trustworthy, and I can't realistically be sure that my money will actually be going towards saving lives and not towards paying the wages of some admin staff or paying for a fancy new desk in their London office. And these kinds of objections, to be fair, they're not unfounded. I mean, take the Oxfam scandal in Haiti from a few years ago, for example. You wouldn't want to give your money to charity thinking that your donations were going to be used, like they were in Haiti, to pay the wages of staff who hire underage local girls for sex, and to pay for the buildings that they bring those girls to. It goes to show that one doesn't automatically become trustworthy and saintly in virtue of working for a charity, and you can't be sure that all charitable work will actually bring about a positive effect. And then what's more, you might say, even if the charity is trustworthy, we don't, necessarily know where exactly our money's going. I once heard the analogy, I don't remember who made the analogy, but they said that the way that charity kind of works today is it's like going into a shop and giving the shop owner a wad of money and saying, here's what I'll spend, you can give me whatever you like in exchange for it. Because when we give to charity, we don't know exactly where our money's going. And that seems kind of absurd. I mean, when we buy things, we want to know exactly what we're getting. We want to know exactly how much for. And why shouldn't this be the case when we write a check to charity? So the point that these people are making is that while we do have an obligation to save the drowning child in the pond, we might not have such strong moral obligations to give money to charity because, frankly, we have less certainty that our donations will actually save a life in the first place. Whereas with a child drowning in a pond, we know that we can save them. But, and I think this is how Singer would reply, well, fortunately, we don't live in a world where all charities are black holes. I say we don't live in a world where all charities are black holes. I'm sure that an awful lot of them are. But as I touched upon earlier, there are fantastic organisations out there, such as GiveWell, who perform astonishingly detailed research into exactly where our money goes when we give our money to some of the most cost-effective charities. And using their research, GiveWell compile a list of recommended charities. You can see this on the top charities page on their website, that according to their calculations will provide the most cost-effective benefits that will save lives with the least amount of money. And with the rigour of their investigations, I don't think that there's much reason to doubt, if you're giving money to the most cost-effective charities, that donations of around $3,000 to, the likes of maybe the Against Malaria Foundation really will save lives. And even if you still remain sceptical, and if you maybe look at GiveWell calculations and you just don't find it robust enough, well, this seems to be more of a reason to contributing to making charity evaluators more accurate, rather than just abandoning charity and abandoning all of the avoidable suffering and avoidable deaths altogether. So where does this leave us? Well, I'm hoping that in this video, we'll have seen that many of us in the developed world have immense opportunities to do a lot of good and even to save lives. We've seen that, according to some philosophers like Peter Singer, these opportunities are actually so strong that they actually place a moral obligation on us. We're morally required to give money to effective charities and to save lives. And finally, if the likes of Singer are right, and for the record, not all philosophers agree that Peter Singer is right for some of the reasons that we've looked at in these objection slides, and there are many more arguments out there as well. But if Peter Singer's right, then, well, perhaps our social norms actually need to be updated. The idea that giving to charity is obligatory isn't widely accepted yet, but maybe it should be. Maybe, given how much good that we can all collectively do, charity shouldn't just be something that we do as and when we feel like it. Perhaps it should become a much more central part of our lives. If any of you are interested at all in reading a little bit more about our moral obligations to give to charity, reading Singer's essay that I mentioned earlier, Famine, Affluence and Morality, is a really good place to start. It's where he first put forward his drowning child argument, and it's really well written, and you can find it online, I'm sure, with just a quick Google search. If you're interested in reading any books on the topic, I'd also recommend Peter Singer's book, The Life You Can Save. Or there's also a philosopher here, actually at the University of Oxford, Will MacAskill, who wrote a fantastic book called Doing Good Better. Both of these books are really accessible and really interesting to read. And then finally, there's a couple of websites you might be interested to check out too. If you go to www.givewell.org, as we've spoken about, you'll see that they publish a lot of really valuable information on exactly which charities are the most effective worldwide, which is, I think, worth knowing if you want your money to make a difference. And then finally, there's 80,000hours.org as well. They're an organisation who they post advice on choosing a career to make a difference. So perhaps the good that you can do through your career is an alternative to giving money to charity. It's another way of making a difference. And their website is really interesting to scroll through if you're interested at all in thinking about these kinds of things a little bit more.